So let's focus on realism. We're going to make a study, meaning just a sculpture that's for practice, and it's just going to be of one thing, of just the nose. So I'm going to start by creating a base, just a flattened piece. This is my backing. I want it to be about 1/2 inch in thickness. And you can really go any size, but I tend to try and make a fairly life-size or a slightly larger sculpture when I'm practicing. Too small and it's just really hard to get into all those details. I'm going to kind of roughly draw out this triangular shape to show my nose, and then I'm going to create a triangle shape out of clay. Please note that which nose you're sculpting is going to determine the length, the width, and the depth. So I would recommend for beginners that you sculpt the nose you're most familiar with, which is probably your own nose, right? So keep in mind, like, what nose are you sculpting, and therefore what is the width and the length and the depth of it. I'm using water-based clay, so I am scoring and slipping to attach, because if I don't, then my clay, if I were to fire it, will pop off. I actually didn't use slip here because I'm not going to keep this piece, but please make sure that you do score and slip for a keeping sculpture, one that you are going to fire. I'm pressing and then blending together, but I'm being careful that I don't lose all the detail of the depth and the size of my piece. So I need to have a good secure attachment, but I also don't want to lose all that work I already did. So I'm going to gather my tools, and generally I end up using this kind of cut up card for the majority of it. I'm going to start by making the planes of the nose. So you can see here generally what the planes are that I'm going for. I've got the top and side, and I've got the underside, and then the kind of normal top side of the nose. So I'm going to work on this for a while, and you should do the same if you're following along. I'm scraping with it's just a credit card, but you could also use any, like if you had a steel rib or a rubber rib or a wooden rib, like if you have actual sculpting tools. But I find that especially if I'm working from home, these old gift or credit cards work perfectly well. And you can notice I am removing clay, and so this is why I do tend to start with a slightly larger piece than I'm ending up with. So just anticipate that whatever amount of clay you start with, you're going to end up with a slightly smaller nose, right? So if you know the exact proportions you want to go for, then scale it up just a little bit. And I want to make sure that I'm checking my profile view, and I noticed here that I do need to add a little bit of clay to that underside. So like everything, in ceramics and sculpture, we are sculpting in the round, right? It is not a two-dimensional piece where you only see it from one perspective. So I do need to think about all the different points of view that I and any viewer is going to look at the work, and make sure that I'm not forgetting about something. You don't want to forget about it and then try and go back to that roughing in stage when you've already done all the details. And so again, I'm just going to continue to really work on the profile and the angles of everything here. It takes some time to really get these the way that I want them to look, so don't feel like you need to rush it. For the nostrils, I like to use this wooden modeling tool. So first I want to mark out where they go, and then I kind of press in and then outward, and that helps actually start to round out the nose to give that rounded shape of the nostril. So then I want to think about the curve of the nostrils, right, and the upper kind of portion. And so first I'm just going to define that a little bit with my fingers, kind of wrapping my fingers around. And then I'll come in with the curved part of my wooden modeling tool to sort of cut in just a little bit. Now again, remember, whose nose are you sculpting? Because this is a place that also has really major differences from person to person, right? Again, how wide is the nose? How defined is the nostril? How subtle is it? All of those things are going to give specific characteristics that start to take your nose or any facial feature from generic sort of, whoever to a specific person. Now remember, at this stage, you're still roughing out, and it should look pretty blocky still, right? So those planes actually really help you identify what areas you're working on. So at this point, I'm thinking about the apex or the tip of the nose and starting to round that out. And as I'm looking at the profile view, I'm also thinking about, is there a smooth transition from that tip of the nose to the bridge of the nose? Is there sort of a turned up nose? Is it, does it dent in, right? Again, all of those details are important to creating a specific individual or character. So at this point, I'm really beginning to round and soften the edges all over. So I'm removing those harsh edges of the planes. And that's because I really do have all the details that I need in the majority, right? So there are small details that I still need to add. As you're doing this, make sure that your fingertips are clean so that you're not just dragging chunks of clay along your piece. And then as I go, I might notice areas that I need to define. So like this is the lower portion of my nose, the bow of the nose or the philtrum, and the kind of underside of the nostril. So starting to define those philtrum and those lower outer nostrils. As you're working, it is not uncommon for sculptors, if they're doing figures, to feel their face to kind of get a feel for it as well. So don't hesitate to do that. Obviously, you might have to clean your hands first or clean your nose after. But it is a great way to get a hands-on feel to what you're actually working with. So in that way, you kind of have a model already always with you. So at this point, I needed to wash my hands because my clay was just kind of getting really all over my fingers and making the smoothing stage really hard to do. So keep in mind that, when you're working rough, your hands might be messier, but as you start to get more detailed, you'll probably need to keep your hands a little bit tidier. So for the nostril, that needs to be shaped more. I'm still working on it, but keep in mind that a nostril is not round, right? It is more like teardrop shape, and so that should be reflected in the sculpted piece. I want to think about this kind of bow of the, it's really the bow of the lip, but it moves up a little bit into the nose. And so at some point I need to basically kind of cut in a little bit, depending again on the type of nose that I'm sculpting. Right, but generally it's not always going to be this like immediate transition, right? So right there, by just kind of tucking that under a little bit, I'm going to define that nose a lot more. I also find that just pinching in towards the nostrils is great because it can help add a little bit more depth to the area between them and keep them from being too rounded. And this is, of course, possible if you have a life-size or larger piece. This is a slightly larger than life-size here. So make sure the transition from the nose, like the bridge of the nose, down towards the cheek is blended and smooth. And you can see that line was created because I had a chunk of clay on my finger. So just showing again that we want to keep an eye on what's on our finger when we're smoothing. And I could even press this out. So if I was actually sculpting something, if I was sculpting on something that wasn't solid, right, a flat piece like this, I could actually add more dimension to, say, the cheeks as well. Now, in hard to reach areas like this, you might need a brush, and I prefer to work with it just barely damp. I find that helps to smooth it, but it's so important that you do not oversaturate your clay. So a brush is great for those hard to reach areas, which for faces certainly happen, right? And so I'm just using the brush to kind of smooth out the edges and soften them. So sometimes you need to go back in and remove some more clay or add some more clay, and that's just because as you're refining it and you're revealing the kind of smooth surface, you'll notice those details that might be missing. So don't hesitate to go back and do this, right? It is totally a normal part of the process. It doesn't mean you did it wrong. It just means that you have a good eye. You're noticing that and adjusting and fixing. And so as a study, right, a practice piece where we're practicing our technique, this is pretty much where you want to be, right? You don't need to worry overly much about smoothing and getting rid of clay crumbs in every single possible area. That isn't to say don't pay attention to craftsmanship, but really this is this is a completed study as is.